The hearing room wasn't tense at all. Instead, there was a distinct feeling that everything had already been decided. People sat in their places, orderly, with papers stacked neatly. Voices were kept just loud enough to be heard. It wasn't the silence of anxiety, but the silence of people who believed the outcome was already firmly in their hands. On the right side of the room, the Caldwell family sat together. Richard Caldwell leaned back slightly, his hands clasped over his knees, his gaze calm like a man accustomed to making decisions without needing to explain them. Beside him, Margaret Caldwell sat with a perfectly straight back, her expression under absolute control. She showed no emotion, yet she created an invisible pressure. She didn't look around the room because, in her mind, there was nothing left worth her attention. Ethan sat between them, not entirely comfortable, but composed enough that no one would notice. He adjusted his cuff once, then placed his hands on the table as if he'd rehearsed the pose. In his mind, this wasn't a confrontation. It was just a necessary procedure to put everything back in its proper place. He didn't look toward the door, nor did he expect any surprises. The way he understood it, she was already lost. Lost her place in the family, lost her right to speak, and eventually would lose the child. The courtroom door opened very gently, not making a loud noise but enough to shift the atmosphere. A few people turned their heads, then more, and within seconds nearly the entire room was looking in the same direction as Elena Whitmore walked in. She wasn't rushing, nor was she hesitant. Her steps were even, slow and steady, like someone who was fully prepared for what was about to happen. She wore nothing striking, no eye-catching colors, no elaborate jewelry, just a simple, neat outfit. But what made it impossible to look away wasn't her appearance, but the way she carried herself. Her left hand rested lightly on her belly. It wasn't to draw attention or seek sympathy, but simply a natural reflex, a silent presence of the one thing this room seemed to be deliberately ignoring. She didn't look around, didn't scan for reactions, because she already knew. She had been watching them for a very long time. As she approached the table, she stopped at a careful distance, not too close, not too far, just enough to create a boundary that no one could cross uninvited. Only then did Ethan look up. Their eyes met, and for a very brief moment, his expression remained unchanged before it flickered. It wasn't guilt, nor was it regret, but more like a vague discomfort, as if the image in front of him no longer matched the story he had constructed in his own head. He said she didn't have to come here like this, his voice low, still trying to maintain the control he believed he had over the conversation. Elena didn't answer right away. She just looked at him, not searching, not questioning, simply looking, and in that silence, something became heavy, because for the first time, he realized she hadn't come to negotiate, she hadn't come to explain, and she certainly hadn't come to beg. She said she didn't come to argue, but to ensure there was nothing left for him to decide. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was enough to create a small shift in the air. Richard's fingers tightened slightly. Margaret tilted her head, studying Elena more closely now, no longer with dismissal, but with assessment. Richard asked what she meant, his voice still calm, but no longer as certain as before. Elena didn't answer with words. She reached into her handbag, her movements slow and deliberate, with no hint of haste. She took out a document and placed it on the table, face down, no explanation, no introduction. Just a single action that carried a weight no one could ignore. Ethan frowned. Margaret leaned forward slightly. Richard hadn't moved yet, but his gaze had changed. "Turn it over," Elena said, her voice soft but firm. Ethan hesitated for just a second, but it was enough to show a wavering he'd never shown before. He reached out and flipped the paper over. His eyes scanned the first line, then the second, and his face tensed, not obviously, but enough for Elena to see the confusion, the resistance, and a pause he couldn't control. Margaret snatched the paper and read it quickly. Her confidence was still there, but now it showed a crack. "What is this?" she asked, her voice sharper than she'd intended. Only then did Richard lean in, take the paper, and read it more slowly, more carefully. And unlike Margaret, he didn't speak right away because he understood this was no longer what they thought it was. No one stood up, no one raised their voice, but the balance of power had shifted silently and irreversibly. Elena looked at them the same way she had been observing them for months, without reaction, without explanation, just letting them figure it out for themselves. "This," she said, "is the part you never thought to ask about." Ethan looked up again. This time, there was no controlled expression, no prepared explanation. There was only a question that came far too late, because whatever he thought would end today, whatever outcome he believed was certain, was now no longer in his hands. And what stunned him wasn't just what he had read, but the fact that he had no idea when he had lost control of it all. Elena held his gaze for one more second, then turned away. It wasn't an act of avoidance or weakness, but because she didn't need to look anymore. The decision was no longer his. In fact, it hadn't been for a very long time, and what they thought was the end was only the beginning of the truth. Back then, everything started so normally. It was even easy to believe it was a good start. Elena met Ethan at a small fundraiser for a community health care program. Most attendees were there for their reputation or public image rather than any real need. But she was different. She was there early, checking lists, talking with the organizing team, asking detailed questions about underserved areas. The way her voice softened whenever she spoke about people who had no other options made others take notice, not because she was trying to impress anyone, but because she genuinely cared. Ethan noticed her right away, not because she stood out, but because she wasn't trying to. He was used to people trying to get his attention, used to pre-packaged compliments designed to please him. But Elena did none of that. When he spoke, she listened. When he shared an opinion, she didn't rush to agree but asked questions that made him think, not to challenge him, but to understand better. It made him feel comfortable in a way he wasn't used to. Their subsequent meetings happened naturally. Nothing was formally arranged, yet they were consistent. He took the lead more often, inviting her for coffee, asking about her work, about her life. Each time, Elena answered just enough, never evasive, but never revealing too much, as if she always kept a part of herself that no one could reach too easily. Ethan liked that, or at least, he thought he did. He told his friends she was different, that she wasn't like anyone he'd ever met, that she made him feel like he was talking to a real person. And for a while, he believed that was enough to build a relationship on. Their wedding wasn't too big, not too extravagant, but it was enough to please his family. Everything went smoothly, according to plan, without any disruptions. From the outside, it was a stable marriage, maybe even an admirable one. But from the very beginning, Elena noticed something that not everyone sees right away. The warmth in the Caldwell family wasn't natural. It was conditional, and the conditions were never spoken aloud. Margaret was the first person who made her feel it. She never acted annoyed, never said a harsh word, never criticized her openly. But her gaze would always linger a little longer whenever Elena said something, as if she were weighing, comparing, and placing every answer on an invisible scale that only she understood. During family dinners, Margaret would ask what seemed like very normal questions. She'd ask about Elena's work, about where she grew up, about the people she used to live with. Her voice was gentle, polite, with no hint of pressure, but the way she looked after each answer made the questions feel anything but simple. "Elena, where is your family from?" She once asked, her hand still holding a glass of water, her tone unchanged. Elena explained that she had grown up in many different places, that her life hadn't been settled, that she'd learned to adapt from a very young age. Margaret nodded, smiling faintly, but her eyes never left Elena's face, as if she were searching for something left unsaid. "And what about close relatives?" she continued, her voice still full of polite interest. Elena said there weren't many, that she didn't have a lot of close ties, that most of what she had built on her own. Margaret nodded again, this time more slowly. The smile remained, but it was no longer as warm as before, as if a piece of a puzzle had just clicked into place in her mind. Those questions didn't stop there. They came back in different forms, in different contexts, always gentle, always polite, but always with the same purpose: to confirm whether Elena had anything of her own to stand on. Richard was different. He didn't ask much, but whenever Elena answered Margaret, he would listen in silence, never interrupting, never reacting right away. But sometimes his eyes would rest on her for a beat too long, as if he were committing every detail to memory. Ethan didn't notice it. Or, if he did, he didn't see it as a problem. Whenever Elena brought up the questions, he would just laugh lightly and say his parents only wanted to get to know her better, that they cared, that they just needed time to get used to her. Elena didn't argue. She didn't debate it. She just listened, and she remembered. In the beginning, Ethan really tried. He took her out more, tried to create private time for them, and avoided situations that might make her uncomfortable. He would take her side in small conversations, gently correcting his mother's words. Those actions were enough to make him feel like someone she could trust. But there was one thing that changed so slowly. Elena was the first to notice it: the way Ethan reacted when pressure was applied. At first, he would still speak up, still defend her. But gradually, he began to choose silence more often. Not because he agreed, but because he wanted things to be peaceful. He started saying things like, "Let's not make a big deal out of it," or "It was just a question," or "You're overthinking it." And each time he did, Elena's boundaries were pushed back. Just a little bit more. It wasn't obvious enough to react to, not big enough to be called a problem. But it was repeated often enough to become something noticeable. Elena didn't argue. She didn't try to change him. She just watched. She let everything unfold as it would, letting each person's choices reveal themselves, letting the unspoken things slowly rise to the surface. To Ethan, it was a marriage that was settling in. To his family, it was an arrangement being tested. But to Elena, it was a process of understanding. Understanding how a family operates. Understanding how a man makes his choices. And understanding that some things just need time, not force, to reveal themselves. At that point, everything still looked fine. Fine enough for outsiders to believe nothing was wrong. Fine enough for Ethan himself to believe he had chosen correctly. But Elena didn't see things that way. She wasn't looking at what was being shown. She wasn't looking at what was being hidden. And she knew, very soon, what was hidden would not stay buried for long. Things began to change in a way that was hard to notice at a glance. There was no explosive moment, no harsh words, no clear conflict, just small suggestions, gentle adjustments, and statements that sounded so reasonable that to object would make you seem like you were overreacting. Margaret was the one who initiated the change. She didn't make direct demands, but started with perfectly timed concern. She said Elena should rest more, that a pregnant woman's body needs careful attention, that the outside world had too many things you couldn't control. Her voice was as gentle as ever, but this time it had a new layer of certainty, as if what she was saying wasn't a suggestion, but a predetermined course of action. Elena didn't react right away. She listened, nodded, didn't deny it, but didn't agree either. She understood perfectly well that sometimes the biggest changes don't come from commands, but from things repeated often enough to become what's reasonable. Ethan adopted the idea faster than she thought. He started echoing his mother's words in a softer way. He'd say maybe she should take a few days off, then a few weeks, that her work could wait, that her health and the babies were what mattered most. He didn't force her, didn't argue, but the way he said it made refusing more difficult, because if she said no, it would look like she was choosing her job over her family. At first, Elena kept going to work. She adjusted her schedule and reduced her workload, but she didn't stop completely, and that very fact began to create a silent friction within the Caldwell family. Not because they needed her to be home, but because they needed her to comply without explanation. One evening, Margaret was more direct. She didn't raise her voice, didn't blame her. She simply asked what Elena was trying to prove by clinging to her job. She said, "A woman in this family should know her priorities, that some things are more important than proving yourself." And when she said it, she wasn't looking at Elena as if they were having a debate, but as if she were disciplining a child. As if Elena's place in this family was already set in stone. Ethan sat beside her, not saying much, but he didn't object. And his silence carried more weight than any words of agreement could. Elena still didn't argue. She simply asked if continuing the work she was devoted to was truly wrong. Margaret didn't answer directly, only saying that right or wrong wasn't as important as what was suitable for the family. And in that sentence was a very clear boundary. Suitability was not for Elena to decide. After that, things moved a little faster, but still slow enough that no one would feel it was coercion. Elena's work schedule started to face more interference. Meetings were advised to be canceled, trips suggested to be postponed. Calls on her phone were sometimes missed because Margaret decided she needed to rest. And every time it came with a reasonable excuse, nothing outrageous, nothing big enough to warrant a strong reaction. Ethan gradually and naturally fell in line with it all. He started using more familiar phrases, that it was just temporary, that she could go back later, that now wasn't the time to push so hard. He didn't realize that every one of those sentences was pushing Elena further away from the very life she had built for herself. Elena's outside relationships began to shrink in the same way. No one forbade her from seeing friends, no one told her not to keep in touch, but there were always reasons that made it harder. A get-together was rescheduled because it was inconvenient. A phone call was cut short because she was resting. Messages went unanswered for a while, and slowly those connections weakened without anyone ever having to directly sever them. Once, Elena mentioned she wanted to rejoin a community activity she used to do. Margaret smiled and said that was admirable, but unnecessary right now. That there were plenty of other people who could do it, that Elena's responsibility now was to be at home. The statement sounded perfectly reasonable if you didn't listen too closely. But if you looked deeper, it wasn't advice. It was a redefinition of her role. Ethan agreed immediately. He said his mother only wanted what was best for her, that there was nothing wrong with taking a break, that sometimes letting go is a way of protecting yourself. And in the way he spoke, Elena began to see something clearly. He no longer to distinguish between her choices and his family's desires. Still, Elena didn't react strongly. She didn't argue, didn't try to prove a point, didn't try to win back control through confrontation. She just observed, memorizing every small change, every sentence, every reaction. Because she understood that some forms of control never look like control at all. Not everyone who controls you looks like a controller. Some do it with concern, with logical reasons, with advice that makes you feel like you're the one in the wrong for not listening. And that's what makes it so much more dangerous. At a certain point, Elena realized the issue wasn't about whether she continued to work or not, or who she met or talked to. The issue was that those decisions were no longer truly hers. They were being gradually shaped by the people around her, guided, adjusted, limited, until her own choice existed only on the surface. Ethan didn't see it, or maybe he did, but he didn't want to face it. Because to him, everything was still fine. There were no big conflicts, no arguments, no obvious breakdown. And that led him to believe that what they were doing was right. But for Elena, things were becoming clearer. Not because of one specific event, but because of a chain of small things, repeated so many times they were impossible to ignore. And in that quiet peace, she saw something others couldn't. When control is disguised well enough, it no longer looks like control. It looks like a form of care that you can hardly refuse. And that was when she began to understand that what was happening wasn't a temporary phase. It was how this family operated. Subtly, reasonably, and nearly impossible to resist if you didn't see it from the very beginning. Things didn't stop with gentle advice and soft limits. They went a step further when the papers started to appear. Not all at once, not in a rush, but one by one, at just the right time, in just the right circumstances, making it harder to say no than to just sign. It was a very normal afternoon. Elena was sitting in the living room when Margaret approached, holding a neatly arranged folder. She placed it on the table in front of her with a gentle smile, no tension, no pressure, as if simply asking her to look over a small family matter. It's just some paperwork. For her medical care, Margaret said, her voice perfectly even and calm. It's just so we can handle things more quickly, you know, in case of an emergency. The way she used the word we was so transversal, as if everything was already a joint decision, as if this was just a necessary step that everyone understood. Elena looked down at the stack of papers, not rushing to pick it up. She let it sit for a few seconds, long enough to feel the atmosphere in the room, before gently turning to the first page. Ethan sat not far away. He wasn't directly participating, but his eyes would occasionally drift toward her, as if waiting for a specific reaction, not an explosion, but the quiet, reasonable agreement he believed was logical. The initial content didn't seem unusual. Clauses about allowing relatives to act on your behalf in an emergency, details related to hospitals, doctors, treatment options. It was all written in legal language that was clear but not overly complex, enough to make the reader feel this was all perfectly normal. Elena turned the page, and then another, and another. She wasn't skimming. She read every line, every phrase, slowly, not missing a single detail. And it was in those later lines, the ones most people would just glance over, that the important things began to reveal themselves. The right to make decisions in certain situations would no longer be hers. The right to access the child's medical information was extended to the Caldwell family. Certain clauses allowed others to make choices on her behalf if she were deemed temporarily unfit. It was all worded so cleverly. It didn't directly strip her of her rights, but merely extended them to others, merely ensured that the family could intervene when necessary. And it was that phrasing that made it all seem so reasonable if you weren't reading carefully. Elena paused on one section longer than usual. It wasn't because she didn't understand. It was because she understood perfectly. She didn't look up right away, nor did her expression change. She just continued to the final page, where the signature line was waiting, marked with a small, neat sticker, all ready to go. Margaret watched her, not rushing, not saying another word, but her gaze never left Elena's slightest movement, as if she were calculating how long it would take for her to arrive at what Margaret considered the obvious conclusion. Just then, Ethan spoke up. His voice was light, not pressuring, but it carried a clear expectation. "It's just to make things simpler," he said. "In case something happens, we won't waste time dealing with formalities." Elena set the papers down. She didn't close them. She didn't push them away. She just set them down. The silence stretched for a few seconds. No one rushed to break it. And it was in that silence that the most important thing happened. Not in words, but in a decision. She looked up at Margaret first. Then she looked over at Ethan. Her gaze wasn't sharp, or cold, or soft. It was just a look clear enough for them to know that she had read it, she had understood it, and she had made her choice. "I'm not signing this," she said. Her voice wasn't high or harsh or filled with any negative emotion. It was simply a complete sentence. Margaret didn't react immediately, but the smile on her lips faded ever so slightly, not enough for anyone to easily notice, but enough to change the air in the room. "You don't fully understand what's in it, dear," she said, her voice still patient. "This is for your benefit and the child's." Elena didn't explain. She didn't argue. She didn't point out which clause. She just repeated very concisely, "I'm not signing it." Ethan's brow furrowed slightly, not in anger, but because he didn't understand, or didn't want to understand, why she would choose this path. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said, his voice still controlled. "This is just paperwork for a worst-case scenario." Elena looked at him, and in that look there was no defiance and no submission, There was only one very clear thing. She didn't need to explain herself to be understood. She said nothing more, offered no reason, made no attempt to convince them. She simply stood up, gently pushed the stack of papers back toward Margaret, and that single action said everything that needed to be said. Margaret took the papers. This time, her smile was gone. She didn't raise her voice, didn't create a conflict, but her eyes had changed. It was no longer a look of assessment, but one of confirmation. Confirmation that Elena was not as easy to control as she had thought. Ethan said nothing more. He watched as Elena left the room, and in that moment, there was something he didn't realize. He had just sided with a decision he didn't fully understand. As for Elena, when she walked out of that space, she didn't feel relief, nor did she feel stress, just a greater clarity in her thoughts. Because there are some things that don't need to be debated, don't need to be proven. Simply disagreeing is enough. She knew exactly what she had just refused. It wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a transfer of power that, if she hadn't been paying attention, would have happened so naturally. And the most important thing wasn't the content of those terms. It was the fact that they were presented with the confidence that she wouldn't read them carefully, that she would trust them, that she would sign. But they were wrong, not because she was suspicious, but because she always reads. And sometimes, what makes a person dangerous isn't that they're strong. It's that they understand exactly what they're refusing. As for the Caldwell family, that moment wasn't a failure. It was merely a delay, and that very way of thinking was what would push everything even further. After that afternoon with the papers, the atmosphere in the house didn't change in a way an outsider would notice. There were no arguments, no harsh words. Everything kept up its appearance of normalcy. Dinner was still served on time. The conversation at the table still revolved around familiar topics. But something had shifted, very clearly. Not in the words, but in the distance between them, in the way they looked at each other, in the brief moments that no one had ever paid attention to before. Elena didn't try to break that silence. She didn't ask about it again, didn't bring up the past, didn't give any sign that she was resisting. She went on as before, keeping her routine, answering when spoken to, listening when others talked. But inside, the way she observed things had changed. It was no longer about trying to understand. It was about confirmation. Conversations in the house started to stop abruptly whenever she walked in. Half-finished sentences were diverted to other topics with an unnatural ease. Quick glances were exchanged and then vanished. It was all very small, very hard to pinpoint, but it was enough to form a pattern that, if you watched long enough, was no longer random. One evening, Elena was passing by the kitchen after everyone else had gone to their rooms. She had no intention of stopping, but the voices from the other side of the slightly ajar door made her slow her pace. It wasn't because the words were loud, but because of how they were spoken. Low, fast, and deliberate, meant not to be overheard. She didn't move closer. She didn't press her ear to the door. She just stood there, far enough not to be discovered, yet close enough for fragmented sentences to reach her. Margaret was the one doing most of the talking. Her voice had its usual calmness, but this time it lacked its soft veneer. It was more direct, clearer, as if she were speaking to people who already understood the full context. "The girl didn't sign," she said, not hiding her displeasure. "But that doesn't change the plan," Richard replied, his voice low and concise. "We don't need that signature right now." After a short pause, Margaret continued, "She thinks she's holding on to her rights, but she doesn't understand that rights aren't contained in a piece of paper." Elena stood perfectly still, not moving, not making a sound. She didn't need to hear the rest to understand where the conversation was going. Another voice cut in, softer, somewhat hesitant. It was Ethan. He didn't say much, but his question was enough to reveal what he was thinking. "Do we really need to go that far?" he asked, his voice not entirely certain. Margaret answered immediately, without hesitation. "If you want everything to be stable, then yes." There was no argument, no counter-argument, Just a statement, laid down like a final conclusion. Richard added, "Everything has to be arranged before the child is born. If we wait too long, we'll lose control." Hearing that, Elena understood enough. No more details were needed. She didn't need to know the specifics of what they were going to do. She had the complete picture. She turned and walked away, her steps light, no faster than usual, making no difference in her rhythm. As if she had never stopped, as if she hadn't heard a thing. When she got back to her room, she didn't turn on the light right away. She stood in the darkness for a moment, not because she was in shock, not because she needed time to calm down, but because she was organizing what she already knew with what she had just confirmed. She wasn't surprised. That was the most important thing. There was no sudden moment of realization, no unexpected feeling of betrayal, because deep down she had suspected it all along. From the way Margaret asked her questions, from the way Richard listened without reacting, from the way Ethan chose silence when he should have spoken. All those signs weren't separate incidents. They connected, piece by piece, until they formed a truth so clear it didn't need to be said out loud. What she overheard tonight wasn't new information. It was just proof. A confirmation that what she had been observing wasn't just speculation. It was reality. Elena sat down on the edge of the bed, her hand on her stomach, not for comfort, but to keep herself centered. She wouldn't let emotion dictate her decisions, wouldn't let anger or hurt guide her actions, because she understood perfectly well that an emotional reaction was exactly what they were prepared for. She chose silence. But that silence wasn't acceptance, and it wasn't weakness. It was data. Every sentence she heard, every pause between words, every choice of phrase, it all became information she could use. She didn't need to confront them right away. She didn't need to expose them just yet. She didn't need to prove that she knew. Because some truths, when held until the right moment, become far more valuable than when they are spoken immediately. For the Caldwell family, everything was still going according to their plan. They believed they were a step ahead, that they were in control of the situation, that Elena was just a small part of the system they could adjust as needed. But what they didn't realize was that their very confidence made them say more than they should have, reveal more than they thought. And to someone like Elena, who didn't react, didn't argue, didn't fight back directly, every word they spoke became another piece of the puzzle. And when there were enough pieces, the picture would no longer be blurry, it would be undeniable. Elena lay down, closing her eyes, not to sleep, but to steady her thoughts. There was no need to rush, no need to act now, because what she had just gained wasn't a chance to react, but a chance to prepare. And this time, she was no longer observing just to understand. She was observing to end it. That morning began like every other morning in that house. Everything moved with a familiar rhythm. Light streamed through the large windows, the scent of coffee drifted through the air, and the staff moved just quietly enough not to be noticed. On the surface, there was no sign of what was about to happen. Elena woke earlier than usual, not from a lack of sleep, but because she no longer needed much sleep to remain calm. She knew this day would come, not exactly when, but she knew it was inevitable, and when it arrived, she didn't want to be swept away by its emotions. She put on a simple outfit, without much thought or deliberation, as if how she looked today was far less important than everything else. Then she walked down to the living room, where the Caldwell family was already seated. That was unusual. They rarely gathered at the same time in the morning without a clear reason. Richard sat in his usual spot, Margaret beside him, Ethan across from them. And there was one other person Elena had never seen before, a younger woman, professionally dressed, her expression confident but distant, as if she knew she was in the right place but didn't quite belong to it yet. Elena didn't pause on the stairs. She walked down normally, her gaze sweeping over each person, resting for a beat on the strange woman before moving on. She didn't ask a question, didn't show surprise, didn't give them a reaction they could use to control the situation. Margaret was the first to speak. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was clear, stripped of its previous softness. All that remained was a prepared decisiveness. "We need to talk," she said. It wasn't an invitation. It was an announcement. Elena nodded slightly, pulling out a chair and sitting down. She placed her hands on her lap, her posture stable, not closed off, not open, simply ready to listen. Richard began. He didn't beat around the bush or offer a long explanation. He went straight to the point, his voice low and steady, like a verdict that had already been agreed upon. "This is no longer a suitable arrangement," he said, looking directly at Elena. "We have considered the matter and concluded that the current situation no longer benefits this family." There was no sorry, there was no regret, just a cold, concise phrasing designed to sever ties without explanation. Ethan said nothing. He stared down at the table, his hands clasped together, not because he wasn't listening, but because he didn't want to be the one to say those words. Margaret continued, "You will need to pack your things and leave today." Her voice remained controlled. "Arrangements will be made to ensure there is no trouble for you." Elena listened, then waited a moment. She didn't ask him to repeat himself, didn't ask for clarification, didn't argue. She just held her gaze on Margaret for a second longer before turning to Ethan. "And you?" she asked, her voice soft, without any hint of pressure. "What do you think?" A simple question, but it was enough to force him to choose a side. Ethan looked up. His eyes met hers for a fraction of a second before quickly looking away, as if holding her gaze for too long would make him say something he didn't want to. "I think this is getting more complicated than it needs to be," he said, his voice unsteady, but trying to remain calm. "My parents just want to stabilize the situation." It wasn't a direct agreement, but it wasn't a refusal either. An answer somewhere in the middle, enough for him to avoid taking full responsibility, but also enough for Elena to understand that he had already made his choice. Margaret gestured slightly toward the other woman. "This is Sophie," she said. "She will be filling the position that you are no longer able to." There was no hiding the meaning in her words, no beating around the bush, no softening the blow. Sophie smiled, taking a small step forward. Not too close, just enough to be seen more clearly. Her gaze toward Elena held no hostility, but no shyness either, like someone accepting an opportunity she believed she deserved. "I'm sorry things worked out this way," Sophie said, her voice soft, rehearsed. "I hope you'll be all right." It sounded like a word of comfort, but it was missing the most important thing, sincerity. Elena looked at Sophie for a second. No judgment, no reaction, seeing her simply as a piece of a picture that had already been arranged. No one in the room said anything for the next few seconds. The silence wasn't long, but it was long enough to make everything clear. No further explanation was needed. Margaret broke it. "We've made arrangements for the child to stay here," she said, her tone as matter-of-fact as if stating the obvious. "It's what's best for its future." That one sentence was the only thing that made the air in the room palpably shift. Not with a sound, but with weight. Elena didn't lean forward, didn't clench her fists, didn't change her posture. She simply placed a hand on her stomach, a light, natural gesture, and looked directly at Margaret. "No," she said. Just one word. Not loud, not drawn out, but perfectly clear. Margaret's brow furrowed slightly. Not out of surprise, but because she wasn't used to being refused so directly. "You are not in a position to decide that," she replied, her voice still controlled, but with a new, harder edge to it. Elena didn't argue, didn't explain why, didn't offer any reasons. She just repeated herself, a little more slowly this time. "No." Ethan took a breath as if about to say something, but then he stopped. He looked back and forth between Elena and his mother, his gaze unsteady, as though he knew what was right, but lacked the courage to voice it. Richard stood up, the movement decisive. "There's no need to drag this out," he said. "You can pack your things and leave today. We will handle the rest." Elena gave a small nod. No protest. No hesitation. No asking for more time. She stood, turned, and walked up the stairs, her steps even, not faster, not slower, as if this was something she had already planned to do. Sophie watched her go, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. It wasn't regret. It was the dawning realization that this was not the reaction she had expected. No tears. No anger, no pleading, just a very ordinary departure, and that was precisely what made it all so unsettling. When Elena came back down with a small suitcase, not carrying much, only the things that were truly hers, she paused at the doorway. She looked back one last time, not to remember, but to confirm that there was nothing left there worth keeping. Ethan took a step forward, as if he wanted to say something, but then stopped. The distance between them wasn't great, but it was one he couldn't bring himself to cross. "Elena," he said, his voice low, "don't make this any harder." She looked at him, and this time there was nothing searching in her eyes. "You already have," she replied, her voice perfectly calm. No blame, no bitterness, just a fact. Then she turned and walked out the door. No looking back, no stopping, no trace of hesitation. Behind her, the house stood, looking just as it always had. But inside, something had changed that they hadn't yet realized. They thought they had just replaced her. But in reality, they had just removed the only thing that could keep it all from collapsing. As the door closed behind her, Elena didn't pause on the steps or glance back. She walked straight to the gate with the same steady pace she'd had walking into the hearing room, no faster, no slower. It was as if this was just one more step in a process she had been observing for a long time. What made that morning different wasn't that she was asked to leave, but that she had been waiting for this exact moment to confirm the final piece she was missing. The taxi pulled up to the gate. The driver glanced in the rearview mirror, saw a pregnant woman with a small suitcase, and asked a perfectly normal question. If she was all right. Elena nodded slightly and said she was fine. Her voice wasn't strained, trying to sound strong, because she didn't need to prove anything to a stranger. She just needed to be sure she hadn't missed anything. And as the car began to move, she didn't gaze out the window with regret. She looked at the details in her mind, arranging them in their proper order. Her observations hadn't started today, or even the afternoon with the papers. They started much earlier, with the times Margaret asked questions that didn't need a full answer, with the way Richard would listen without reacting, with the silences that fell between sentences, and especially with the way Ethan chose silence at the very moments he should have spoken. None of it was big enough to be evidence on its own, but pieced together over time, they formed a clear structure she could no longer ignore. Elena didn't see these signs as attacks. She saw them as information. Every question about her background, every mention of being a good fit for the family, every suggestion she quit her job, every document presented at just the right time. It all pointed in one direction. This wasn't random. It was how a system operates when it wants to maneuver someone into a predetermined position. And the most important part wasn't what they were doing, but their belief that she wouldn't see it. She did see it. But she didn't react right away. Not because she wasn't strong enough to object, but because she needed to understand just how far they would go. She needed to know where their limits were. She needed to see the choices they would make when they met no resistance. Because some things only reveal themselves when you don't stop them from happening. In the weeks prior, when the rhythm of conversation in the house shifted, when sentences were cut short, the moment she entered a room, when she somehow missed important calls on her phone, when her work schedule was adjusted for her own good. She didn't fight back immediately. She didn't create conflict to assert her rights. She just watched, to see how far each of them would go if they weren't stopped. And what she saw wasn't an outburst. It was consistency. Margaret didn't change her tone, just her topics. Richard didn't change his attitude, just his decisions. And Ethan. He didn't become a bad person overnight. He just gradually chose what was easy over what was right. And that gradual shift was the most important part, because it showed this wasn't a momentary lapse. It was a choice. When the document was placed in front of her, Elena didn't read it looking for a reason to refuse. She read it to confirm what she already knew, that rights aren't just transferred with a signature, but by who you allow to interfere in your life. And when she put the pen down without signing, she didn't need to explain why. Because if they had needed an explanation, they would have asked her before they wrote those terms. When she heard the conversation behind the half-closed door, she didn't stop out of curiosity. She stopped because she had been waiting for it to happen. Not to eavesdrop, but to hear the truth when they thought no one was listening. And what she heard wasn't a detailed plan, but a mindset. A belief that they had the right to arrange everything as they saw fit, as long as they did it skillfully enough to avoid immediate protest. Elena didn't see herself as a victim this story. She didn't put herself in the position of being pushed out. She put herself in the position of an observer, watching a system in operation. And when that system reached the point where it no longer bothered to hide itself, when they could speak openly about a replacement, about keeping the child, about her departure being a necessary step, she knew her observation period was complete. She wasn't weak. But more importantly, she didn't need to act strong, because strength isn't about reacting quickly or speaking loudly. It's about fully understanding what's happening before anyone else realizes you do. And when you finally act, you don't do it to prove a point. You do it to end something that is already over. The car stopped in front of a nondescript building. No large sign, no ostentation, just a place discreet enough to work and clear enough for those who needed to find it. Elena got out, pulling her suitcase behind her. There was no one waiting to greet her, no dramatic scene to create a sense of reveal, because what she had wasn't something that needed to be put on display. She walked inside. The receptionist looked up, asked for her name. She gave it. A few minutes later, a man emerged and introduced himself as Daniel Harper, the lawyer she had contacted, not today, not yesterday afternoon, but from the moment she realized that the most important decisions should never be made when you're backed into a corner. They didn't start with long questions or a full retelling of the story, because most of what was needed had already been prepared. The small notes, the text messages, the changes in behavior, the offers that were made. Elena had documented it all in a way no one would have noticed. Not to build an accusation, but to have a clear picture when the time came. Daniel didn't seem surprised by anything she said. He just nodded, asked a few specific questions, and then opened another file, not to create new power, but to correctly use what already existed within the system. And that was something the Caldwell family hadn't considered. They thought power lay in controlling spaces and people. They never considered that some things can't be controlled that way. Elena sat down, placing a hand on her belly once more, not out of fatigue, but to remind herself of the real reason for every decision. This wasn't about winning a confrontation. It was about ensuring that no one could ever make the most important decision for her. She didn't need to say much, didn't need to explain at length, because the entire process leading up to this moment was the answer. And when she left that house, she didn't carry the hurt as a burden. She carried the data as a foundation. And that was precisely what would make everything that came next fall completely outside of their predictions. Stepping out of the gate, Elena didn't look back. Not because she was trying to be strong, but because there was nothing left behind her to confirm. Everything worth understanding, she understood. Everything worth seeing, she had seen. And to linger any longer would only be to step back into the very place they had prepared for her. The road ahead was unremarkable, just a familiar street, cars passing by, people who had no idea who she was or what had just happened. And that very normalcy made the moment feel even clearer. Because the world outside doesn't stop for a decision made inside a single house. The small suitcase rolled behind her, not heavy, not full. It held only the things that were truly hers. Things she didn't have to fight for, didn't have to justify, didn't have to ask permission to take. And that was enough to keep her from looking back at what she'd left behind. The phone in her pocket buzzed once, then again. She didn't need to take it out to know who was calling, and she didn't need to rush to answer. Not because she was avoiding them, but because some calls only come when it's already too late. Answering now wouldn't change a thing. Elena kept walking. Her pace didn't change. Her breathing was even, not rushed, not heavy, because she wasn't carrying panic. She was carrying clarity, and the two are completely different. She remembered her first days in that house. The neatly arranged dinners, the questions that seemed like concern, the carefully hidden judgments in their gazes. And the way everything slowly changed without anyone ever naming it. If she had reacted back then, if she had chosen to argue over every little detail, things might have exploded sooner. But she also might never have seen the whole picture. She didn't do that. She let it all play out. Not because she accepted it, but because she needed to understand. And once a person understands enough, they don't need to stay behind to prove they were right. A car pulled over to the curb, the driver rolling down the window to ask if she needed a ride. Elena nodded, opened the door, placed her suitcase inside, and sat down. The movements were simple, without hesitation, without a single glance backward. As if the decision had been made a long time ago and was only now being carried out. "Where to, ma'am?" the driver asked. Elena gave the address. Her voice was steady, without a break, showing no sign that she had just walked away from a place she once called family. The car started to move. The city slid past the window, unchanged. The buildings still stood. The streets were still busy. The people still hurried on with their lives. And that made it all the clearer. What had just happened wasn't an event that changed the world. It was a decision that changed the direction of a single person. Elena didn't wonder if she could have done things differently, didn't blame herself for not saying more, didn't think about going back to fix things, because she understood that the problem wasn't a specific moment, but the way everything had been built from the very beginning. Ethan had a chance to speak. Margaret had a chance to stop. Richard had a chance to choose differently, but they didn't. And when you see so clearly how other people make their choices, staying is no longer an act of patience. It becomes an act of acceptance. Elena did not accept it. Not with words, not with arguments, but by leaving. The car stopped in front of a building she knew well, not a strange place, not a temporary shelter, but a place where she could begin without having to explain who she was, without needing to prove her worth, because there, value wasn't decided by other people. She got out of the car, pulling her suitcase behind her, and walked inside with the same rhythm she had used to walk out of the Caldwell house, no faster, no slower, as if there was no rupture between the two places, only a transition. Her phone buzzed again. This time she took it out. Ethan's name was on the screen. She looked at it for a second. Then she turned it off. No anger, no trembling, no hesitation. Just a very clear choice. Because some conversations are no longer necessary, not because there are no words left to say, but because there is no reason left to say them. Elena stood still in the lobby for a moment, not to rest, but to reset her own position. She was no longer the one being pushed out. No longer the one who had to adapt to a system that wasn't hers, but the one who was actively stepping out of it. And in that moment, something became clear in a way that no one needed to say out loud. She didn't leave because she had lost everything. She left because she understood enough. Understood how they saw her. Understood how they made decisions for her. Understood how they believed she would never realize it. And when a person understands that much, staying is no longer the right choice, not because they are weak, but because they no longer have a reason to remain in a place that has shown them exactly what it is. Elena walked further inside as the door closed behind her, not with a loud sound, not marking some dramatic end, but it was enough to separate two worlds. On one side was the place she had just left, where everything was controlled by a constructed sense of reason, and on the other was where she stood now, where everything would begin again, on her own terms. And this time, no one could say she didn't know what she was doing. As the elevator doors closed behind her, Elena didn't feel the kind of relief a person feels after escaping something. It was the feeling of someone who has just stepped into their rightful place, no longer having to guess what was going on, no longer having to react to decisions made for her, but beginning to work with the things she could actually control. The building she entered wasn't glamorous, with no details meant to impress, but everything was arranged clearly, functionally, in rhythm, like a system that runs properly because it doesn't need to prove anything. It just needs to work. Daniel Harper was waiting for her in a small conference room. Simple wooden table, chairs that weren't too soft, no excess. He stood as she entered, gave a brief handshake, didn't ask long social questions or show any surprise, as if he had been preparing for this meeting all along. Elena sat down and placed her bag beside her. She didn't need to open it right away, didn't need to rush her presentation, because most of what was necessary had already been sent ahead. The notes, the timelines, the small details that meant nothing on their own, but when placed together, formed a clear, logical sequence. Daniel opened the file and flipped through a few pages, not rereading the whole thing, just pausing at the key points. He asked a few short questions, confirming a time, confirming a context. He didn't delve into her emotions, didn't ask how she felt, because in this space, what mattered wasn't feeling, but structure. What they tried to do isn't outside the scope of what we've seen before, he said, his voice even and unhurried. The issue isn't what they were thinking, but what they did and how much of it can be proven. Elena gave a slight nod. She didn't need to be reassured, nor did she need to be told she was right. She needed to know what the next step was, and Daniel understood that. He pulled another folder toward him, not new paperwork, but existing legal frameworks. The regulations on a mother's rights, on protections in cases of suspected coercion, on limiting a third party's right to intervene without clear consent. We're not creating new rights, he said. We're using the rights that already exist. The statement was simple, but its simplicity was precisely what made the difference. Elena didn't need a strategy to retaliate. She didn't need to find a way to hurt the people who had hurt her. She just needed to ensure that what belonged to her couldn't be taken away in a manner they had decided was reasonable. Daniel pointed to a specific item in the file, explaining how the terms in that earlier document could be seen as an attempt to improperly expand their authority. How making decisions on her behalf without clear justification could be challenged. How a series of small behaviors, when placed in the right context, could become proof. Elena listened, not taking notes, not interrupting. She didn't need to write anything down because she had already memorized it. What she was doing wasn't learning something new, but rather placing what she had already observed into its proper place within a system she understood. We don't need to prove they're bad people, Daniel continued. We just need to prove that they crossed a boundary the law doesn't permit. That was the point the Caldwell family had failed to consider. They thought power lay in controlling her living space, in deciding who could stay and who had to leave, in setting the conditions others had to obey if they wanted to continue existing within their system. But they failed to see that there are larger systems, ones that don't depend on personal will, that aren't governed by emotion. And when you step outside their sphere of control, the rules they created no longer apply. Elena didn't talk about how she was treated. She didn't use heavy words to describe it. She simply presented what happened in sequence, the time, the context, and how those actions connected to each other. Nothing added, nothing omitted, nothing embellished. Daniel nodded, partially closing the file. This is enough, he said, needing no further explanation, because in this system, clarity was more important than emotion. What's the next step? Elena asked. The question was short, direct, without a trace of impatience. Protection first, Daniel answered. We ensure that no one can make decisions for you regarding matters related to the child. Then we deal with the rest. Elena nodded, not asking what the rest was. because she understood that things would come in their proper order. The most important thing right now was to lay the foundation, not to launch a counterattack. She didn't want to make them pay immediately, not because she had forgiven them, but because she didn't need to. Revenge is a reaction. What she was doing was a choice to put herself in a position where no one could decide for her. When the meeting ended, Elena stood up and shook Daniel's hand. There was no lingering, no superfluous words of encouragement, just a mutual understanding of what needed to be done next. She walked out of the room. The hallway was still quiet, the lighting unchanged. Everything was exactly as it was when she had walked in, but her position in this story had changed. She was no longer the one being placed in a situation. She was the one resetting its structure. Outside, the city moved to its own rhythm. No one knew what had just been decided in that small room, and it didn't matter, because the most important changes rarely happen in noisy places. They happen in quiet spaces where things are put back in their rightful place. Elena stepped onto the street and paused for a beat, taking a deep breath, not to calm herself, but to confirm that she was exactly where she needed to be. She felt no need to go back. She felt no need to say anything more. She felt no need to prove that she was right. Because strength isn't about your ability to hurt others the way they hurt you. Strength lies in not needing to do it at all. The strong don't need revenge. They just need to use the right system. And once that system is set in motion, the rest will happen in a way that no one can stop. No one in the hearing room was prepared for that moment in the way they had imagined. What they thought would be a procedural meeting became the point where all their assumptions began to fall apart, layer by layer, not with a bang, but with a clarity that made it impossible to go back. The document was still on the table. Ethan held it in his hand longer than usual, his eyes scanning the lines he had just read. No longer a quick glance to get it over with, but a re-examination, as if he were trying to find another interpretation that would put everything back in the place he had believed it to be. But the more he read, the harder it was for him to maintain his composure. Margaret didn't wait. She reached a hand toward him. "Let me see that again." Her voice was no longer as steady as it had been, but she was still trying to control it, as if reading it more carefully would make everything go back to normal. Richard leaned forward, no longer keeping his distance. He needed to see it directly, to confirm with his own eyes, because he understood better than anyone that when a document is placed correctly within a legal process, it's no longer just a piece of paper. It's a position. The judge looked down at the file, then up at Elena, her gaze devoid of emotion but sharply focused. "We will clarify the contents of this document," she said, her tone even, not too fast, not too slow, to determine the scope of the protection order. Attorney Daniel Harper stood up, unhurried, creating no drama. He simply opened the file he had prepared, turned to the correct page, and began with a simple sentence. "Your Honor, we are not asking the court to make a ruling based on emotion," he said. "We are only asking the court to look at the chain of conduct and the intent demonstrated through the other party's documents and words." He didn't read the entire document, only quoting the necessary parts, one section at a time, just enough to draw a clear line. The first part was the clauses from the earlier document, the ones that expanded the Caldwell's rights to make medical decisions should Elena be deemed temporarily incapacitated. The phrasing was indirect, but it was enough to create an opening for intervention. This, standing alone, might be seen as a precautionary measure, Daniel said. But when placed in the overall context, it becomes part of a larger effort. He moved on to the next section. Records of Elena being told to stop working, of her communications being restricted, of appointments being interfered with, of contact being cut off, not through explicit commands, but through reasons presented as concern. "We are not suggesting that advising someone to rest is wrong," he continued, "but when those recommendations become repetitive, systematic, and lead to a reduction in that person's access to information and support, we need to look at the intent behind them." The courtroom remained silent. No one interjected, no one immediately objected, because the presentation gave them no opening for an emotional reaction, only a logical one. Daniel paused for a beat, then turned to the next section. And most importantly, he said, are the direct statements of intent. He didn't need to play the entire conversation, only quoting the core parts. The phrases about making arrangements before the child is born, about losing control if it's left too late, about not needing a signature right now. Margaret shifted slightly. Richard squeezed her hand gently. Ethan sat perfectly still, but this time it wasn't a neutral silence. It was a silence that had been pulled into the center of the conflict. The judge shifted her gaze to the Caldwell family. "Do you deny making these statements?" she asked. Richard was the first to react. He stood, trying to keep his voice calm. "We don't deny that there were discussions," he said, "but they came from a place of concern for the child's future. There was no intention to coerce or take away her rights." The judge gave a slight nod, not refuting him, but simply moving the questioning in a different direction. "Then we will clarify this with direct testimony," she said, then looked toward Ethan. "Mr. Ethan Caldwell, please rise." Ethan was a beat slower than requested, but he stood, his shoulders slightly tense. His eyes were no longer trying to completely avoid contact, but seemed to be searching for something to hold on to. "Were you present during the conversations regarding the plan for Ms. Elena to leave the house while the child remained?" the judge asked. Ethan swallowed hard, glanced quickly at his parents, then faced forward again. "Yes," he answered, his voice low. "And did you agree with that plan?" The next question came immediately, leaving no room to breathe. Ethan was silent for a second, not because he didn't understand the question, but because he understood all too well where the answer would lead. We thought it was for the best," he said, the words incomplete, but enough to reveal his choice. "Did you personally tell Ms. Elena that the child would stay with your family and that she would have to leave?" The judge pressed. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief moment, then opened them. This time, he didn't look away. "Yes," he said. There was no way to rephrase it, no further explanation, just a confirmation. Margaret shook her head slightly, as if to stop it. Richard remained in his place, but the look in his eyes had changed. It was no longer one of complete control. The judge noted the answer, then looked down at her file. "So we have a pattern of behavior and statements indicating intent to interfere with the mother's rights before any legal grounds permitted it," she stated, her tone still neutral, but leaving no room for ambiguity. Daniel didn't need to say another word. He just stood still, letting the pieces fall into place on their own. Elena sat in her seat, her posture unchanged. She showed no sign of triumph, didn't glance their way, didn't look for a reaction, because what she needed wasn't for them to recognize their mistake, but for the system to recognize the structure of their behavior. The judge continued, "The court will consider the request for immediate protection of Ms. Elena's rights concerning the child," she said, "and in the meantime, any attempt to interfere, apply pressure, or make decisions on her behalf will be restricted." There was no loud bang of a gavel, no dramatic conclusion, but the important thing had already happened. The document on the table was no longer just a piece of paper submitted by Elena. It had become a point of reference in a larger decision, a part of a system the Caldwell family could not bend to their will. Ethan sat down, more slowly than he had stood up. He placed his hands on his knees, unable to maintain his previously composed posture. He didn't look at Elena, didn't look at his parents. He just stared at the floor, as if trying to reconcile what had just happened with what he had always believed to be right. Margaret remained silent, for the first time without an immediate response. Richard leaned back in his chair, saying nothing, but the certainty in his eyes was gone. Elena's expression didn't change. Her breathing didn't quicken. She didn't smile. Because this wasn't a victory in the conventional sense. It didn't come from defeating someone, but from putting everything back in its proper place. And when the truth is revealed not through emotion but through structure, through a pattern of behavior, through the words of those involved. Then no one can claim they don't understand what is happening. It wasn't because they were surprised. It was because they had chosen not to see it until they could no longer look away. After the hearing, there was no confrontation in the hallway. No sharp words were exchanged. No one chased another for a final answer. Everyone left in an orderly fashion, just as they had entered. The only difference was that each person now carried a truth they could no longer arrange to their own liking. Elena walked out with Daniel. They didn't say much. There was no need for a summary, no need to rehash what happened. Because in spaces like this, the important thing isn't the final emotion, but the fact that everything has been put in its proper place. And once that happens, the rest takes care of itself. The Caldwell family left behind them. No one called her name. No one tried to hold her back. Not because they didn't want to, but because they no longer had a way to do so without making things worse. And that silence, for the first time, was no longer their tool. In the days that followed, nothing exploded. No news went wide, no outside attention. Everything unfolded in a way many would call normal. But within the circles they once controlled, changes began to appear. Not large, not immediately obvious, but enough to create a disruption in the rhythm. A phone call was postponed. A meeting was rescheduled. A partner asked for more time to review things. No one stated the reason outright. No one mentioned the hearing. No one used harsh words. But in the way they asked questions, in their choice of words, there was a new caution that hadn't existed before. Richard was the first to realize it, not because he was more sensitive, but because he understood how these small signals worked in his world. He called a longtime partner, his voice maintaining its usual calm, but the answer he received wasn't as firm as it used to be. They didn't refuse him. They just said they needed to review things further, that there were some factors to clarify, that they wanted to ensure everything aligns with current standards. Those words weren't a rejection, but they were no longer the default trust he was used to. Margaret began to feel it in a different way, not through her work, but in how people responded to her. The greetings were still polite, but the pauses between questions grew longer. The conversations ended sooner. No one said anything wrong, but no one spoke the way they had before. She didn't accept it at first. She told herself it was just a coincidence, that everything would go back to normal once people forgot about the insignificant details. But each passing day brought another small sign, and when those signs repeated often enough, they were no longer coincidences. Ethan felt the shift in a way that was harder to name. He wasn't on the big calls, wasn't in a position to make decisions, but he saw the difference in how his father reacted, in the way his mother's silences stretched on longer, in how conversations at home no longer flowed as easily as they once had. He called Elena a few times, not to argue, not to explain, just to say something he never got the chance to say, but none of his calls were answered. It wasn't because Elena wanted to punish him. It was because she was no longer in a position where she had to continue a conversation that was already over. Sophie didn't stay around for long, either. There was no dramatic exit, no official explanation. She just started showing up less, and then not at all, as if her initial confidence had been built on a foundation she hadn't bothered to inspect too closely. And when that foundation shifted, she chose to step away before she had to face it. All of this happened quietly. No one stood up and declared that the Caldwell family was in the wrong. No one criticized them publicly. No one tried to make them lose face. But because there was no noise, the changes were even clearer, because they weren't obscured by emotion. Elena took no part in any of it. She didn't follow up, didn't ask questions, didn't request information. She didn't need to know what they were going through, because what was happening didn't depend on whether she was watching or not. She focused on what belonged to her, the routine checkups, the necessary appointments, the decisions concerning the child's future, and in those matters, there was no room for distraction. One morning, while sitting in a doctor's waiting room, Elena looked around at the other women waiting, each with her own story. No one knew who she was, no one knew what she had just been through, and that made her realize something very clearly. Her worth didn't change based on how other people treated her. What the Caldwell family did hadn't taken that from her, and what was happening to them wasn't giving anything back to her, because this wasn't an exchange, it was a consequence. And consequences don't need noise. They don't need to be announced. They don't need to be proven. They just need to unfold according to their own structure. Richard was slowly beginning to understand that, but it was too late to adjust, because once trust is questioned, it doesn't just return to its former state with an explanation. Margaret understood it too, but she couldn't accept it. She tried to keep everything as it was, but the gaps that had opened up in her relationships couldn't be filled by pretending nothing had changed. Ethan stood in the middle of it all, with no clear position left, no easy choices. And for the first time, he had to face the fact that the decisions made to keep things calm had led to an outcome he couldn't control. Elena didn't see those moments, but she knew they would happen. Not because she wished for them, but because that's how any family system reacts when one of its parts no longer functions as it did before. She didn't need revenge. She didn't need to hurt them. She didn't need to tell them they were wrong. Because none of those things would change anything. What changed everything was the truth being put in its proper place. And when that happens, the rest unfolds on its own, slowly, surely, without anyone having to push it. Consequence doesn't need to be loud. It just needs time. The final weeks of her pregnancy passed in a completely different rhythm than anything Elena had ever experienced before. No more interrupted conversations, no more judgmental looks, no more decisions being made for her. There were only things that needed to be done, routine checkups, and days organized around the needs of her body and the child she was carrying. The apartment she lived in wasn't large, with no elaborate details, but everything had its clear place. The space was quite quiet enough for her to hear her own breathing, bright enough that she never had to search in the dark, and most importantly, everything in it was hers in the simplest sense of the word, needing no one's validation. Mornings began with small things: making a glass of warm water, opening the window to let the light in, reviewing her appointment calendar, rereading the notes she'd prepared for the day. There was nothing special about it, but the stability in those small actions created a feeling she hadn't had before, a sense that everything was moving in a direction she understood. Daniel Harper still kept in touch, not every day, not with long calls, but with short messages confirming progress, providing necessary information for the next step. There were no superfluous inquiries, no intrusion into her personal life, because what needed to be done was already in place. The rest didn't need repeating. On the day of the birth, everything happened exactly as it should have. No drama, no panic, just a process her body had long prepared for. The doctor and nurses worked to their familiar rhythm. Elena didn't try to control every detail. She just focused on the only thing that mattered in that moment, keeping herself steady, keeping her breathing even. And when the baby let out its first cry, the sound didn't surprise her. It felt more like a confirmation that an important part of her life had officially begun. She didn't think about what had happened before, not because she was trying to forget, but because that moment had no room for the past. She looked at the child placed in her arms, small, warm, completely dependent, and in that gaze, there was no comparison, no calculation, only one very clear thing. From now on, every decision she made would revolve around protecting and nurturing the life she was holding. The days that followed brought no sudden major changes, no dramatic feeling of a new life. It was just a series of small, repetitive tasks: feeding, sleeping, waking, checking, adjusting. And in that sequence, Elena found a different kind of stability, not one created by circumstance, but one that came from knowing what she was doing and why. She didn't recount her story to those around her, didn't seek sympathy, didn't explain what she had been through, because it couldn't change the present, and it wasn't necessary to validate her worth in this new space. The people she met at the hospital, in her building, in the places she went, they didn't know who she was before. They only knew her as a new mother, and that was enough to create a starting point undefined by what had already happened. Occasionally, her phone would still light up with unanswered calls, with unread messages, but Elena didn't have to make a decision each time. She had already made her choice, and that choice didn't change from moment to moment. She didn't block, didn't delete, didn't react. She just let them sit there, like things that were no longer relevant to her current path. The apartment gradually changed with the new rhythm of life. Necessary items were added, new sounds emerged, and the silence felt different than before. And in that change, there was no room to look back at what was lost, because what she had now was clear enough to need no comparison. Elena didn't put a name to what she was experiencing. She didn't call it being strong. She didn't call it overcoming. She just kept doing what needed to be done, one day at a time, without rushing, without procrastinating. And in that simplicity, a different kind of strength began to form. Not the strength to confront, not the strength to prove a point, but the strength to continue, a strength that didn't need to be seen, a strength that didn't need to be acknowledged. It just needed to exist in its own right. And in the quiet space of her apartment, as the baby slept peacefully in its crib, Elena sat beside it, not thinking about what was past, not imagining what might happen. She was just there, in the present moment, where everything was enough. Not because it was perfect, but because it was real. And for the first time in a long time, she no longer needed to watch in order to understand. She just needed to live. Months later, the story didn't disappear. It just changed in the telling. It was no longer a specific event within a family, but something recounted in different versions, each person adding a detail, removing another, emphasizing the part they found most memorable. Gradually, it was no longer one person's story, but a lesson passed by word of mouth. Some said it was a story about a family who had misjudged a woman, that they acted as they did because they didn't know who she was, that if they had known from the start, things would have been different, that it was all just a mistake in recognizing her value. Others told it differently. They said it was a story about power, about how a person who seemed to have nothing actually held things others couldn't see, and that the lesson was to never underestimate someone, because you never know what they are capable of. Those tellings weren't entirely wrong, but they were all missing something. Elena didn't listen to those stories, not because she was avoiding them, but because they no longer affected how she lived. She didn't need to control how others understood her story, nor did she need to correct every detail to match the truth, because the truth doesn't depend on how it's retold. Her life continued at its own pace. There were no sudden major changes, no perfect ending like the ones people love to hear. There were only days following one another, small tasks completed, and choices made based on what she knew to be right. The child grew up in that space, unaware of what had happened before he was born, not burdened with stories he didn't need to carry. And for Elena, that was enough, because she didn't want to make the past a defining part of her son's future. Sometimes, sitting alone in the evening, she would think back on those earlier days, not with regret, and not to wonder if things would have been different had she acted differently, but just to look back at a chain of events that had unfolded exactly as it had to. And in that chain, she saw something clearly that perhaps she hadn't fully realized before. It wasn't about who was stronger. It wasn't about who was smarter. It was about how people treat one another when they believe the other person has no way of responding. The Caldwell family didn't change overnight. They didn't suddenly become that way. They had always operated that way. It was just that no one had ever put them in a situation where that way of operating was so clearly exposed. Ethan didn't become a different person in that moment either. He just continued to be who he had always been, A man who avoided confrontation, who chose immediate peace over principle. And that choice, repeated enough times, led him to a place where he could no longer change the outcome. Elena didn't hold on to anger, not because she forgot, but because she didn't need to carry it to keep going. She understood that holding on to that emotion would only pull her back to what had happened, when what she needed was to keep moving forward. Over time, the people who knew the story also stopped bringing it up, not because it lost its meaning, but because their own lives moved on with new things, different problems. The story became a memory, an example, something to be recalled when needed. But for those who understood a little more deeply, they didn't remember the story so simply. They didn't remember it as a tale of someone being misjudged, but as a reminder that how you treat others should never depend on who you think they are. Because a person's worth isn't in what they can give you. It's in the fact that they are human, whether you see that or not. Elena didn't have to say a word. She didn't need to turn her story into some public lesson. She simply lived in a way she knew was right, and from the way she lived, those around her could take what they needed from it. If they chose to. And if anyone were to ask about what happened, if they tried to boil it all down to a single simple takeaway, they would probably say that family lost because they didn't know who she was. But that isn't the real story. They didn't lose because they were missing a piece of information. They didn't lose because they misjudged her status. They had lost long before any of that ever happened. They lost the moment they looked at another human being. And decided that person didn't deserve to be treated with basic decency. And once a decision like that is made, the rest is just a matter of time. People think they lost because they didn't know who she was. But the truth is, they lost from the moment they decided she wasn't worthy of common decency. If you've followed this story this far, maybe you didn't just see a situation, but you saw a piece of yourself in it. A moment where you were overlooked, where a decision was made for you, or where you had to choose between keeping the peace, and keeping your self-worth. Not everyone leaves the way Elena did, and not everyone has to. But one thing is always true. You have the right to understand what is happening in your own life, and you have the right to choose how you respond. Whether that choice is to speak up or to walk away. If this story made you pause for a moment, made you think just a little differently, then it has served its purpose. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done in that situation? And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories not just to be heard, but to be understood, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Thank you for staying until the end.